You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
I worked retail long enough. I despise getting out on Black Friday, and I don't know why anybody in their right mind would.
Deals.
Yeah, but here's what nobody realizes. Yes, they have those deals, but most of the stuff, they've ordered like way more than they're actually going to sell on Black Friday.
Oh, yeah.
And so they're actually still there, and if you'll wait till like the week before Christmas, the stores start to panic, and they start to mark them down, sometimes even better than Black Friday.
Yeah.
So,
well, and also there's so many vendor agreements nowadays, it's really hard to get a great deal. I mean, one of the things a lot of people don't realize is most items, occasionally there'll be a certain retailer will work out a deal with a vendor where they can sell one item super cheap, but most of the time, all items are going to be priced according to what is called MAP, which is minimum advertised price. And that changes from time to time. And so whenever you see something go on sale, that's generally dictated not by the retailer, but often by the manufacturer. So
there's your shopping tip.
There's your shopping tip for the day. You know, shop around. You might find one with certain retailers, but I mean, it's very rare. And now there are certain items that maybe you can get only on a Black Friday deal, but that's very, very rare.
Yeah, this isn't like the Cabbage Patch craze of the 80s. This is really, most things today, somebody's got some version of it.
Right.
And let's just be honest, most of them are just as good as the other.
Right.
I hear the heathens are going wild.
Yeah, the natives are going at it again. I don't know what's going on out there. So, I know you're not here for shopping tips. That and Black Friday is already long past for you. So greetings from the past.
We're time travelers.
Yep. So anyway, what are we talking about today?
The Tower of Babel. And this has got to be like, to me, this is one of the most fascinating stories in the Bible. And it always has been. It's just a weird story.
Yeah, it is strange. So why do you find it fascinating?
Well, Chuck, let me tell you. No,
it's you're gonna throw that out there. Well, it's fascinating.
It's fascinating because it didn't make sense to me as a kid. I remember that weird, God's getting onto these people because they want to be close to him, and that was wrong. But then you're going to turn around and give an altar call at the end of your service so I can be closer to God. And that just didn't compute. And even as a kid, I was picking up on that kind of disconnect.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I can see how you get there. I mean, that does seem like the same kind of reasoning that you'd get from like some detractors of the faith that want to say that Adam and Eve in the garden were being punished because they wanted knowledge, and why would that happen when all over the Bible we're told to study and we're told to learn, but then they tend to think that's God acting contrary to himself. And
I think that's where you got to have all the pieces in place.
Yeah.
Because the whole purpose and function, I think, is that God wanted them to turn to him for knowledge. I mean, you've got the creator of the universe there. If there's anything you want to know, what better source? And
right.
to go to an illicit source, then there's a problem.
Yeah, and we still, and it's funny, now that this just popped in my head, just kind of, it's funny when you put it that way, because we're still kind of doing the same thing. We don't want to put the work in. We want a pill that'll make us smart, a pill that'll help us focus, a pill that will help us lose weight, and whatever you want. And so it's like, oh, well, just eat this, and it'll make your problems go away.
That didn't work for Alice.
Oh man, it helped with some of her problems. Just she just had to apply the right one.
And we should clarify, if you need meds for whatever.
Yeah, we're not anti-meds.
They're a tool.
They're a tool, and they're to help you get where you need to go. So yeah, sorry, that was kind of a, but doing it to try to bypass everything else that's where you run into trouble.
Yeah, if it's just the answer for you, then you're probably approaching it wrong. If it's one thing that you're using for an overall plan, then it's probably a good thing. So that's
okay. Well, let's look at this. So you talked about God punishing them.
Mhm.
So I know you may have had this later on in your notes, but why is it that God would punish them for wanting to build this tower?
Well, we got a couple of different things going on, and that's where it starts to get interesting because you're looking at, number one, this is following the flood.
Mm-hmm.
And the command that God gave them coming off the ark is that they're supposed to go out into the world. They're supposed to fill and populate the world. And they are building the city directly to counter what God has commanded them to do.
Right.
They do not want to be dispersed across the world because they've realized there's strength in numbers. And it's not just a tower that people might make a annual pilgrimage to. It really is a place for them to dwell and to stay. And that's the problem. Oh, that's one of the problems. And the other problems really don't become apparent unless you begin to see the context of the story. And the context of the story, I think, is very interesting. And one of my big points, guys, when you read your Bible, don't just read it on your phone. If you will actually pick up a hard copy of it and you can read the headings before and after, you'll notice that what comes immediately before the Tower of Babel, which, by the way, is found in Genesis 11, is where the story is. Right before the Tower of Babel, you have the genealogies of Shem. And then right after, you pick up with the genealogies of Shem again. And so why is there the story in the middle of these genealogies? Because if you read the story closely, the first thing you're going to notice about it is there's no names. Not a single individual is identified. And that's about the only jarring thing in the story when you've read through all the genealogies, and then you get to a point there's no name, says name, 9 verses of no names, and then name again.
Right. It's kind of the very thing they were after to make a name for themselves was the very thing that they were they were denied in the whole process.
Completely denied. And that's, but you don't get that unless you know the context.
Right.
If you just pull it out and put it on a flannel graph, then you lose that.
Right.
And so go ahead.
Now, and just real quick, we did an episode on the retellings, and we were talking about you mentioned the flood, and they were supposed to spread out and fill the earth. And this is kind of a retelling of Eden. When they were sent out from Eden, they were told to go and be fruitful and multiply. And so you have that going on. And now, whenever God tells people to go in the world, and this is actually one of those things that I find interesting, and of course we reference Heiser all the time because he's brilliant. But it was that, you have Eden, but we're supposed to go out. The original mission was for man to turn the world into an Edenic state, to take the dominion over it, to make God's kingdom the whole earth. Mm-hmm. And it's so funny because you get in those retellings, and you get there, you get the flood, and then we just screw it up all the time. And then you keep going, and then you get to the Great Commission, and it's the same retelling over and over. And people think the Great Commission is something new. It's like, no, it's one of the very first things God told us. But what's funny is because we're so Western church and we're so obsessed with sex that what did God tell us? Oh, he said, be fruitful and multiply. He said, have lots of, that's the part that we pick up on. It's not go and take dominion. It's have sex. That's God said we could have sex. I didn't mean to derail you there, but that whole train of thought just it's just so funny because that's where we stop. It's be fruitful and multiply and take dominion over the earth. It's kind of like, so many other verses we read out of context.
I actually had a teacher at ORU, and one of the things he said is we should stop and consider that the be fruitful and multiply command has been fulfilled. and we
Right.
can stop now. So
I guess
do the rest.
Depends on where you're at. Yeah, take dominion. Yeah, look, yeah, it's actually do something with the people we have here now. So sorry, I didn't mean to go on that whole rabbit trail. My mind just spiraled out of control.
Well, we're kind of obsessed even in the church, and I can even go into that, but we won't. So, but this is actually one of those passages I wish everybody could read Hebrew with, because it is like, it's witty.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think we realize how witty God is, how the Bible has been written. And so, I won't bore everyone with all the grammar and everything, but I'll just point out one example. They want to make a name for themselves, and the Hebrew word is Shem.
Right.
So you've got 3 letters that appear over and over again in that word. Then they want to build there, and the word for there is Sham.
Right.
And then the word for heavens, because they want to build a tower in the heavens, is Shemaim.
Okay.
So Shem, Sham, Shemaim. And this is repeated over and over again, and you kind of get this, you corrected my pronunciation on it, leitmotif. Leitmotif. Musical turn that theologians have picked up on and said, hey, there's this aspect, this guiding word, this guiding premise that's going to set the tone for the entire passage. And for this passage, it's that Shem, Shem, Sham over and over again that just kind of lulls you into this very monotonous telling. And it doesn't get, there's no real jarring moment within the story itself. The story placement is jarring, but the story itself is just kind of, it's monotonous.
So you're saying, okay, so basically, well, so what's really funny is because you say it's monotonous, but it's put between 2 genealogies. How much more monotonous do you get? But I would assume that, now again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, you are, so I'm guessing that you've got your genealogies, you're going through the begats, and everyone is, there's like a rhythm to those.
Right.
But then you're saying even that monotonous rhythm is interrupted with an even slower, more monotonous rhythm. It's like, it's like listening to contemporary worship music. There's like the slow, but then you got the rhythm, but then you drop out the bottom for the bridge, so everyone pays attention. Is that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's actually way better of an illustration than I thought it was going to be. So I mean, but yeah, and that's the funny part about this, because when you're reading it, it's just like, if you read it in the Hebrew and you actually read it out loud, and you got to remember, this was written to be read out loud,
right?
Because not everyone had books, and before that, it would have been oral history. Now.
Yeah, and so if you're constructing it for an oral history, that's something that's memorable. You got, and we do that in sermons today, where you have the 3 points and they all start with re, or they all end with tion, or something.
The alliteration.
Yeah, we love alliteration, and it's
or the acronyms.
Acronyms, yeah. It's really funny. I have a coworker who is from England. And she said when she first moved here, and I don't remember how many years ago she moved, but she said she was struck by how many rhyming sayings that we have. We have like all these rhyming idioms. Apparently they didn't have the I'm trying to think of something like blowing and going, or just those things where.
And this is what stands out to her.
This is what stands out to her. But but she's an English teacher,
right? Well, that makes
sense.
So
So she's going to be looking at stuff like that. She also speaks like 5 languages. So, you know, she's used to studying language.
I'm like in awe now.
Yeah, she's brilliant. Maybe we'll probably have to have her on at some point, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. Well, and the other, so couple, just before we actually jump into the story, a couple of things to point out. This is the last major event that affects all of humanity simultaneously.
Okay.
After that, everything starts to break down with God dealing with individual people groups. Right. Because he divides the world, as we're told in Deuteronomy 32:89. So that's important because up to this point, in the Garden of Eden, all of humanity is affected by the events there. The flood, all of humanity is affected by the events there. Now, the Tower of Babel, this is the final event. Now, the other really interesting thing is in all of the ancient Near East, you will find stories about the creation, the flood. You'll find various versions of it. You'll hear different retellings about their flood story, their particular heroes, what have you. There's no parallel to this in any of the ancient literature.
To which one? The Babel?
The Tower of Babel.
Okay. That's interesting.
It really is, because the whole story is a major swipe. It is a major put down against these other cultures.
You mean like a polemic?
Very much like a polemic, but at the same time, it's a very snarky polemic.
Yeah. Well, it's really
sarcastic.
Yeah, it's really funny how little people realize that the Bible utilizes sarcasm. And I mean, it's so funny. Like Paul, when he's talking about circumcision, and he's like, well, it'd be nice if they just slip the blade and just finish the job. Yeah. You go ahead and castrate themselves. And Jesus, you know, when which one was it? There was one where the crowd's coming for him, and he's like, I've done lots of great works. Which of these good things are you coming to crucify me for? You know, it's like, or coming to punish me, or coming to stone me for, I think is what it was. Yeah, he's like,
okay, so we've got that aspect. We can, it's like, you need to be more like Jesus. We can do the sarcasm.
I'm on it.
Yeah,
Done.
the rest of it, yeah, not so much. So we actually, should we read through the story?
You know, let's not do a full read, but go ahead and just.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up the verse that I want to pick up.
Yeah.
Because they said, and this is going to be a very important phrase, and this is a different version than I typically read from. This is the Jewish Publication Society. So if you're reading from the ESV and have been reading along with us and it sounds different, that's why, but you can follow. They said to one another, this is verse 3, Genesis 11:3. They said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them hard. Bricks served them as stones, and bitumen served them as mortar. And they said, come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves, else we shall be scattered over the world. So, first of all, they're going to build this tower. And I think most of us know, or if you spend any time in ancient studies, this tower would be what we refer to as a ziggurat.
Right.
This is the step-sided tower, and this
it's like the blocky pyramid, like the pixelated pyramid.
Almost like the Aztec Mayan
Sure.
kind of. Those are really good images. It's that same form, and this is where we get into trouble because we think that they're building this tower so that they can go up to heaven and somehow challenge God, and that's not why they're doing it. They're building this tower because these towers serve as a stairway for the gods to be able to descend.
Right.
And by building this tower, if it was any other god, then the idea would be that God would have to come down in this particular location, and so they could control,
like a lightning rod.
Yeah, that they could control where God is going to show up, when He's going to respond, and throughout the Bible, when you start realizing that there's this element of people trying to control God, you start finding in the stories time and time again where God's basically saying, you do not get to control me.
Right.
And I love that aspect because what good's a God that humanity can control?
Well, you actually kind of see that that's one of the possible, one of the proposed representations of, or interpretations of Yahweh, which is, you know, who will I say? It's Yahweh has sent me. And when God says, I am, He's saying, I am what I'm going to be.
Yeah.
And you don't get to, I'll be what I'll be. And that's all you need to know.
He was basically denying Noah even the name, because in the Egyptian culture, Moses, yeah, one of those dudes with the long beard. But he was denying Moses a name in a lot of ways, because in the Egyptian culture, if you knew the name of a god, then you could control the god.
Right.
And so here's God saying, no, you don't get to control me. He's doing the same thing here.
We don't do things like we did in Egypt, is what he's saying. Pretty
much. And I think we miss that because we're so accustomed to the story. And we think, oh, look, God's actually telling Noah his name, or Moses his name. I don't know why I'm stuck on Noah. You know, God's actually telling Moses his name.
Different arc.
Yeah, different arc. This is true.
And a different story.
We could get.
You see what I did there?
I see what you did there.
So anyway, but I think that's interesting though, that you have like, this is kind of a foretelling of what's going to happen later with Moses. and that, not necessarily that Moses is going to try to control God. He argues with him aplenty, but that God says, hey, you know what? When people say, who sent you? Just tell them that God who's going to take care of me.
Yeah. Well, and that's the point, is are we going to rely on God for everything? And we're back to Eden again, where are you going to rely on God for the information?
Mhm.
Are you going to let God be the one who teaches you, or are you going to go outside to a different source? And that's really the temptation all of us have. Are we really going to rely on God?
Right.
Or,
It's like a theme.
yeah, that's been lasting for millennia. But these ziggurats, we actually have tablets with different names on them. They show up everywhere in the ancient Near East, and a lot of them have names like the foundations of heaven and earth, or where heaven and earth meet, the gateway between heaven and earth. Which actually, Babel, the word itself doesn't mean confused or to
Right.
talk incoherently. The ancient name for Babel is actually the gate of God.
That actually to me was really interesting to learn that. So that when you said that, I was like, well, that definitely changes things. I always love it whenever we find out that a biblical word or name doesn't mean what we always assumed.
Mm-hmm.
And stuff like you had a great example of this. Was it with Nimrod?
Yeah.
Yeah. That Bugs Bunny was kind of changed our perception of what the word Nimrod meant, because he called Elmer Fudd Nimrod, because Nimrod was known to be a great hunter. And but when Bugs Bunny says it in that context, it sounds like he's insulting him and calling him stupid. And so now Nimrod in Western society often connotates someone being stupid. And then even Goliath. A lot of people think Goliath means giant.
Mm-hmm.
And but it means to strip shamefully naked, and
See, I didn't realize that.
yeah, and
My poor pet dog.
and so no, it's really funny because it's really funny to me is I used to work for a liquor distributor, driving trucks, and there's a type of wine called Rex Goliath. And Rex means king, and so it's really funny because the wine is the king of stripping shamefully naked.
So the emperor's new clothes come into play.
And so I thought that was really funny. It's like, you're using that word, but I don't think it means what you think it means.
Well, and there's another aspect to this too, that not only is this going to be a place where God can come down, in the Akkadian, which is an ancient civilization that was around during this time, their creation story specifically says, actually, let me just read it so I don't mess it up. This is talking about during the time coming out of that chaos time that we talked about with Genesis. It says, when no brick was laid, no brick mold was formed. That's actually part of their creation story. So creation begins with the building of bricks.
That's interesting. So now, does that story go on to do their gods build the world with bricks?
Actually, it's their gods that build the temple. It's their gods that build the ziggurat for trying to remember which Akkadian god it is that he's going to use. He commands the gods to build it. It's not even a human endeavor.
So that takes it even farther, because now you've got people at Babel arrogating themselves to the position of God another way, that like they
Right.
that if it's the gods in that mythology that built the temple, then basically they're saying, well, we have the power of God.
Right. And the thing is, it's funny because, I mean, they even have pictures displaying the gods making the bricks and molding them and baking them. And so this is very much a part of their culture. And this is very central to how people worshiped.
Yeah.
And which I think is interesting. You and I were talking last week. We talked about Genesis 1 being a polemic against the Egyptian gods.
Right.
And so here's God, basically taking a swipe at the gods.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get to Genesis 6, which is the flood story, but it begins with the sons of God, who we believe are angelic beings or divine beings.
Right.
But then they give birth to the Nephilim, who are the great men of renown, the mighty men of old.
Right.
And so they've got this, the heroes of their faith, basically.
Sure.
So God takes a swipe at them at the flood story. And then now we're coming down to God's basically taking a swipe at how the individual practices their religion. How
Right.
do they worship?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of this narrowing of focus from, the highest to lowest that's going on here. And it's like the way you guys have been doing it is messed up. There's a problem here.
Yeah.
So
Oh, that's cool.
yeah,
That's cool.
it really, and you don't get this when you put it in a flannel graph version. It really does become about, oh, well, you're so proud that you could think you can even reach God. And there's an aspect of that, but I think it's you're so proud that you think you can control God.
Yeah. That makes it an even more crazy act of defiance.
Well, we still do it today.
Right. Oh, yeah.
You give God this amount of money and he's going to bless you greatly and you're going to be healthy, wealthy, and wise and seed time and harvest. And okay, I won't go too far on that, but we think we can control God.
Right.
And that's a problem. So.
Yeah, yeah, we definitely, well, and that's like with what you talk about all the time is like the difference between Christianity and witchcraft. The difference between, I guess, worship and witchcraft would be, I guess, probably the more succinct way to say it, is that, if you're worshiping, then you're telling God, like, hey, you call the shots. You're the one who's ruling. But if you're, witchcraft, you're trying to manipulate God into giving you something.
Right. Yeah. Christians operate in submission to the Holy Spirit. In witchcraft, you try to control the spirits. And I don't care which spirit you're trying to control. The minute you start controlling a spirit, and I take a hard line on that because we act like we can control God and we can make appeals to God.
Right.
And I think we're supposed to. And
yeah, we absolutely should.
But to say that, God, you have to do this if I do that, or God's obligated to do anything because we think he is, we're in the wrong. And God doesn't, he's sovereign. It's his way every day. And if we don't take a back seat and let him drive the bus, then God sometimes will let us drive for a while, but we're always going to crash.
Yeah.
Every single time. So, and what's interesting in this is kind of coming back to that, because here they're kind of taking this elevated position of God's to build this. The Bible specifically in the Hebrew calls them the sons of the earth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. That's
and he's not taking any prisoners. I'm trying to B'nai Ha-Adam. So sons of the earth.
Sons of Adam. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and Adam is from the earth. So, and so there's so many other words that God could have used for humanity, for men, it doesn't have to be this specific. So God's just like smack.
Yeah. That's pretty funny. That's really funny.
Well, and then if you notice, they say, come let us make bricks. Come let us build a city. Let us. What's God say? God says, come let us go down. It's just,
Oh, I'm invited to the party. Let me check this out.
Which is funny because their whole purpose in building this is to get God to come down.
Yeah.
And he does.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's like you talk about with Job. I mean, it's a parallel with Job too. When Job basically is, I mean, he's doing it differently. I mean, he's not building a tower, but he is basically going to God and complaining. And when God finally shows up, God doesn't answer his question even. He doesn't do what he expects. He asks him a whole bunch of questions, and Job says, oh yeah, I'm messing with powers beyond me. And yeah, I mean, it's really funny to put that parallel in there too. It's amazing.
Yeah, and when you start to see how this plays off each other, then you start getting these very different threads that come to the surface. And that's, to me, that's what makes it really interesting. And I love the way that God just, there's a little bit of snark, a little bit of sarcasm. And he says, let us, what I love about this, and this is one of those weird little grammar things that's not going to make everybody else as happy as it made me. But when he says, let us confuse or confound their language, the Hebrew word there is a form of another word that you only see. I mean, it's very grammatically correct, and it does mean to confuse or confound, but you only find the way it's written in the past tense or in their future tense that you've got going on here. Because Hebrew's like English, and your different tenses, you have different spellings.
Yep.
And so in this spelling, the letters are the exact same letters as the word for brick, but reversed.
Yeah.
So it's like God specifically designed this one word to just play with their minds to tell us this story, and it's great. I love this. So now God, he pulls up these themes. He pulls off the bricks and the come let us, and he still never identifies a person. He's not against a single individual in all of this. And this is what has led the Hebrew scholars, when they read this, they don't see the sin so much as being reaching up to heaven. They see the sin in the uniformity.
Okay.
That the conformity, the uniformity is actually far more damaging and a threat to the health of humanity than even the rebellious act.
Right. Did you have anything else on that?
No, I actually do. Because
I have something else I want to ask about, but go ahead.
This is a great quote. I brought up the book Subversive Sequels by Judy Klitsner in the retelling, and it says, she wrote this: an individual, even a rebellious one, is more godly than a mindless member of the human herd. And
well, I mean, that would kind of make sense because, I mean, he created us to be above the animals, and he, so for us to deny our individuality, and again, not in a way that just completely throws society into chaos, because there has to be a balance. I mean, it's a both and. You have to be part of society, but you still want to be an individual. I mean, at that point, basically, you are just becoming a herd animal.
Well, and what's really interesting, Rashi tells a story that basically, I'm trying to remember it, that they were building the tower, and as they're building the tower, they're taking the bricks on a pallet up the tower.
Okay.
And a rope breaks, and an individual and the pallet of bricks all fall to the ground.
Okay.
And the city cried and lamented, not over the death of the individual, but over the loss of the bricks. And that's where they're taking this. These Jewish commentators are taking this idea that to be a part of it. Well, cities are never good in Genesis anyway.
Right.
And Cain builds the first one. You've got Sodom and Gomorrah. Then you've got this. Anytime any of the patriarchs go to a city, there's a problem. So there's this idea that cities, there's an evilness about cities.
Well, and it's kind of funny that you bring that up. And this is actually just a quick point on this, because you said we're not going to be doing a lot of covering of Genesis 1. But one of the things that I was listening to Miryam Brand, and great podcast, by the way, Understanding Sin and Evil with Miryam Brand. Oh my goodness, if you want to get deep in the weeds of Second Temple literature without actually being able to read, she's got it. She is so sharp. But one of the things that I found was interesting, and I think it was her that I heard this from, was, when God tells Cain, you're not going to have any land, then Cain builds a city. We think, well, he's just being defiant of God because, he doesn't have land, so he's going to build a city. But no, what's interesting about it, think about this. What was Cain? He was a farmer. And God says, I'm taking away your farm. So someone living in a city is saying, I don't have land. I don't have an inheritance. So I'm going to have to make my way through trade and commerce. So living in the city isn't staking out land. That's living in a place without land. So it is fulfillment of what God said, because we think, oh, well, God made this curse on him and then he just ignored the curse. How do you just get to ignore the curse? That's what we think of in our Western society, because we think of, to build a city, you have to buy land and develop it. But it's the opposite. It's saying you don't have a farm, you don't have a homestead to pass down to future generations.
Well, and that's where, if you look at the idea that God, when they go into the promised land, everyone has their own allotment. Every tribe has their allotment. The families have rules in place to keep the land within the family, within the tribe. The story of Ruth is all about the land. We forget that.
Right.
And so it's very important.
It's not about how to be a pure Christian woman in a romantic relationship.
And when we get to Ruth, we might fry a few people's brains on that one. But no, it really isn't. And so the land is of the utmost importance. This is, you got to remember the next story that comes after this Tower of Babel is God calling Abraham.
Right.
And what's the promise to Abraham? I'm going to give you this land.
Right.
You're going to have a lot of sons. You're going to have this land. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to give you a great name.
Right.
The very thing these other people were trying to create for themselves, I'm going to make it happen for you.
So you're saying that you're not going to be able to systematize greatness. It's all in the hands of God.
Pretty much. I mean, I think we got to be realistic. We live in a world where there are certain formulas that do work.
Sure.
And they work for certain people very well, some better than others. Look at politics, Hollywood.
Right.
Not to get too specific on names. This happens for whatever reason. But then God, he doesn't worry about the systems. The systems don't matter to him.
Right.
And if you're serving the system above God, there's a pretty good chance God isn't going to let you have it. God will disrupt the system a lot of times for people.
Oh yeah.
And I kind of get this. One of my things I think about, and I could be wrong, but one of my theories is if you put anything in front of God, he's either going to let you have so much of it, you're going to drown in it, or he's going to completely take it away from you.
Right.
And sometimes I think, one's not necessarily better than the other. So,
no, neither one, because either one is still judgment. So one thing that I want to tack on here, I just want to ask about this, and this is, again, just me thinking out loud, but it kind of ties in because it says, let's build a tower so lest we be dispersed through all the earth. So we've already kind of covered that a little bit. We were talking about how, they're in defiance of, go out and subdue the earth. So, this was probably before a lot of navigation, that, a lot of, people aren't really, you don't travel to other cities. And so is it kind of this tower is going to be so tall that we can see it wherever we are, and it's going to be kind of our anchor point.
Right. Well, they're on the plains of Shinar.
Sure.
So they're on the word there is actually this round circular disc. So yeah, you would be able to see it for miles.
Yeah.
Because there's no trees, there's no big mountains, there's no it's scrub brush, and probably always has been. It was even great farmland.
Huh.
And it's really so. Even the whole story to say this is where they're at is like these people are so foolish and so stupid,
right?
That they don't even get what you need to build a city.
That's so that's cool. That's just like, again, something off the top of my head. Now you mentioned the land there, that it wasn't good farmland. This is just, I'm going to throw this out there. Biblical geography. We know that's geography is important when we're studying verses. Do you have off the top of your head, or we'll try to put it in the show notes if you can think of one, just a good resource for understanding biblical geography and what the places were like?
I really don't, and I need to find something.
Okay.
Because there's not a lot of people who just focus on climate and culture, and because that's really
there were no GIS degrees.
Yeah, it's not happening
back in the day. Geographical information systems.
No, but I did want to bring out. There's two things that I think are really important. I said that the story shows back up again, over and over again. The next place the story shows up, like really shows up big time, is someplace that you completely do not expect it. And it's in Exodus 1. And what's interesting about Exodus 1 is if you know the Hebrew meaning for the word Exodus, then it gets really interesting. Would you care to take a guess for the name Exodus?
Leaving?
No, well, the Hebrew name for the book.
The Hebrew name I don't know.
Okay, well,
just
you
know
said
the
it.
Bob Marley song.
You said it, actually. It's the Book of Names.
Oh, is it?
It's the Book of Names, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and so if you read through Exodus 1, you kind of get this introductory material where these are the main players. There arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. So he didn't know Joseph's name. He didn't know who he was. And they're scared of the Hebrew people. They're too numerous. They might actually rise up and rebel.
Right. And well, I mean, I guess I probably should have known because the first line, sorry, these are the names, and usually the first line of something is what you'll see something named in Hebrew text.
Right.
So,
and once you get past this little bit of names, like and you can see it's like what, 3 verses. Then you go into a story, and there's no names again. You go back to an account, and in this account, this is Pharaoh, who's, by the way, Pharaoh is never named in the Bible. He's just called by the title.
right.
And so he's giving the account, and he says, "Oh, come let us build cities." And what are they going to build cities out of? Bricks and mortar.
Right.
And, oh, I'm sorry. Actually, that's wrong. They build it out of mortar and bricks. And so in Genesis 11, Tower of Babel, they're building out of bricks and mortar.
Mhm.
And now here's the tip-off. Moses, the author, reverses it, mortar and bricks. So this tells you that even though there's similarities between the story of what's going down, there's going to be a reversal.
Right. Well, and that's actually kind of funny that you mentioned that. I don't know if this is where you're going with it, but so you have people, bricks and mortar, and God comes down and he judges them and he disperses them. Mm-hmm. Now it's speculated that there was the famine, and of course this is getting on with Isaac or Jacob, Israel, Jacob, yeah. So there was the famine, and Jacob and his sons moved to Egypt. Mm-hmm. And one, they're not where they're supposed to be, right?
Right.
So that's one thing. So the famine goes on. They move out to Egypt where they're not supposed to be, quote unquote. I mean, you can look at it however you want, but it's speculated that if it was not for the Egyptian captivity, the 400 years of slavery, that the sons would have just dispersed and not become a nation.
That's a good point.
So it's kind of interesting when you talk about, okay, now we're doing something backwards. We're using the Israelites making brick and mortar and buildings to bring them together.
Yeah. No, that is interesting. I hadn't thought of it from that way, because they are being kind of contained, and the word there in Exodus is actually swarming.
Right. And I'm sorry. And Gifts of the Jews, I think, is where I came across that Cahill.
That sounds like a Cahill thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the word means swarming, and if you go back in Leviticus, it's very interesting. There's a theory that basically anything that swarms, even though it's considered unclean, as far as you were not supposed to touch it and mess with it and what have you, that all swarming things aren't unclean because they aren't good enough for God, but they actually belong to God. And so they're unclean for us to touch, or they're unclean for us to mess with, but they belong ultimately to God.
Okay.
And so this idea of a swarming mass, and what we see in Egypt, the swarming mass, now they're consigned to do building projects, and these building projects reduce people to nameless masses.
Sure.
They do not have individuality. But because we have this tip-off that there is going to be a reversal, we have the first 2 names of an individual in Exodus. Mm-hmm. And it's Sifra and Pua. And these are actually the midwives.
Right.
And they're the ones who stand up against Pharaoh.
Right. They're the ones, yeah, again, you're back to that, the people who are acting counter to the cultural norms, who are not just going along, just go with the flow. Those are the people, again, who get names. I mean, and midwives, they would have been servants.
Yeah.
We don't name Pharaoh, but we name the midwives.
And not only do they get a name, they get a family and they get a home.
Right. And that's where that psalm is, God sets the lonely into families.
Right. And the other real fun piece of this too is if you look at their names in Hebrew, they're anagrams for Pharaoh. They contain all the letters of Pharaoh's name. So the Bible is symbolically setting them up as equal to or greater than Pharaoh.
Right.
Because in the Torah, the name is who you are.
Sure.
It's the essence of your personality.
Right.
And so they're being set up as greater than to Pharaoh because they literally hold life in their hands.
Yeah.
And they're the ones who actually make the final determination, not Pharaoh who's made this decree. They're the ones who say, you get to live.
That's so cool. And when you think about it, and this kind of, I do like that story though, because whenever they're not killing the babies, they go back and what do? They lie about it.
Right.
They say, the Hebrew women, they're not like the Egyptians. They're out laboring all day, so they know how, they're strong enough to, by the time we get there, the baby's already born. We can't do anything.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's.
So it shows back up. And this story in Exodus, I'm going to give a little bit of a hint because we're getting ready to go into the next story whenever we come back our next episode about Abraham in Egypt with Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
We were asked about that. This story actually shows up again, and it's interesting that it's connected to Pharaoh and Abraham
and the Tower of Babel.
The Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
And so just a little hint there, because the Bible is interconnected, that there's not a straight line. It really is this web of interconnected points that you have to get familiar with the text.
Yeah, and actually it was kind of funny. I think it was Chuck from New Community when he was talking about how Israelite history is just a mess.
Right.
It's one of those things that, well, it's kind of like how we tell stories. Like whenever
I don't know what you're talking about.
you do this too. But I'm bad about this. I'll start a story and then be like, well, before we get to that though, you need to understand this part. But the problem is there's no segues within the text like that. So a lot of times you'll get something that, it's like, you're talking on the phone, you say, well, I ran into, I had a wreck, and you're like, well, you had a wreck? What happened? Well, I was digging around in my seat. Well, that didn't happen after you had the wreck. It's that kind of thing where, it's kind of understood within the text that this is, this happened, but then we go back to maybe, then a lot of times we go back to, well, this is what led up to it. So yeah, it's
not in chronological order.
Yeah.
There's a general
Well, that was
flow.
much more succinct.
Occasionally I can do that. Not all the time. But there's a kind of a general flow of this is the direction we're traveling. But then, yes, there are those little points that go back in and explain why this is happening or that is happening. And so as you learn the text and get familiar with it, because there's just no substitute to going through and reading and rereading and
Right.
going over it again. Because, I've been in Genesis for years now. I've just
you've been in there for at least 2-3 years, taking that apart.
And there's just, I keep finding more and more. And even when I was preparing for this, it's like, oh, I need to put that in. Oh, I need to talk about that. Oh, I want to talk about that. Oh, that's amazing. And and it just never stops. And that's the reason why I'm so convinced when people ask me, how are you sure you can trust the Bible? I have not found a point in Scripture that I can stop digging and say, I completely understand this. I've got every bit of good out of this. I just haven't. So when I go through and read this stuff and I see how it is interconnected, it just gets better. It gets more nuanced, more vibrant. And so that's one of the things I hope people are doing, that when we say, hey, read Tower of Babel, read Exodus 1.
Yeah.
See, go back and just, if you read those stories and get familiar with them, it's going to help you, because when we get ready to move into some of these other stories, we're going to be all over the place, because the other thing that I didn't even bring up.
I mean, more so than today.
Well, because I skip so much. But, Rashi even connects the Tower of Babel with Isaiah 14.
Okay.
And Isaiah 14 is the passage about the fall of Satan.
Okay.
So we could have gone down Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel. We could have,
Yeah. Well, and we'll probably still hit some of that later on. But yeah, it's so fun to get into all this and just start pulling it apart. So, what else is that it for today, or do we have more?
Well, I think that kind of gets there. I think the big takeaway, if you don't take away anything else, is stand up, be an individual.
Mhm.
Don't get lost in the herd, and maybe what the status quo is not God's status quo, and so you need to.
So one last thing is, do you think this is kind of your archetypal story for zombie films?
Okay, and we can go on this one because I have taken this apart. But yeah, no, there is something about the zombie. Are you really alive if you're just one of the mass? And what has God called us to?
Right.
And you need brains to be able to determine whether or not you're actually alive and accomplishing and living. And so, what do zombies want? Brains.
Yeah.
Because they don't know. They can't tell on their own. They're not smart enough to figure it out. So. There's a lot of metaphors in there, and you can,
Yeah, we could really, we could go on a whole nother trip, but yeah, that sounds like fun. Maybe we'll do that one day and get deeper into the weeds on that one.
Do that one on Commentarians.
Yeah, maybe we should. So, Commentarians, you can find that at ravencreeksc.com. You can find our show there. You can find blog posts, companion pieces. So go check that out. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, the button's probably over there. But if you're listening on iTunes, be sure to subscribe there. If you really like what you heard, write us a review, iTunes or YouTube, interact with us. Then also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Raven Creek SC. That's where you'll be able to find us. And we'll be sure to we'll be there.
Well, and we want to hear from you. We want to know you're out there.
Yep.
It's encouraging.
And if something from this episode, sparks something in your brain that you want to know more about, let us know. We'll look it up and see what we can find out. But in the meantime, thank you so much for listening, and we'll be glad to see you next week. Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.